My name is Heather Reed. Thank you for being here with me today. I use she, her pronouns, and for those that are using accessibility technology, I'm a 61-year-old white female and I've got ash colored hair, red glasses, and I'm wearing a navy top, and I'm coming to you from my home office. As a reminder to you, every episode of Event Contracts Exposed does not contain legal advice. I am not a lawyer, and nothing that I discuss here should be considered legal advice. This is all about education, insights, and practical strategies offered by a seasoned event professional. At least that's what I'm calling myself today. So, before we begin, I'd also like to note that all content in this presentation is copyrighted and is the intellectual property of Planner Protect. It may not be copied, reproduced, distributed, recorded, or used in whole or in part without my explicit written consent. And I thank you in advance for respecting my work and my original content. So, what is a risk shield? We are talking about how can event contracts be risk shields for events in an unstable world. So as we know, today's world is quite unstable. Event planners are no longer organizing and task takers. They are, amongst many other things, risk strategists. Future ready contracts require proactive thinking, not reactive negotiating. In unstable times, the quality of your event contract may determine the success or the survival of your particular event. And the question that every planner should be asking is, does this event contract actually protect us? So, event contracts are a risk allocation tool, they're a decision-making roadmap for your event, and they are also a financial protection shield when conditions all around us are changing. So, what is a risk shield? Well, I'm fairly new to the term risk shield, and I suspect many of you might be as well. So, a risk shield is usually a contractual or legal protection that reduces a party's exposure to loss, liability, or claims. So, the definition that I put on the screen here says a general business, contractual, or legal term used to describe a strategy, policy, clause, insurance product, or protection mechanism that helps reduce exposure to risk or liability. And when I learned this term risk shield, it immediately resonated with what I've been preaching about for almost 15 years now. Event contracts are not just logistics and financial details, they are powerful vehicles for proactively addressing risk. They can be risk shields for our events. When I started as a planner back in the dark ages of the mid 1990s, like last century, risk management was largely focused on issues like property theft, corporate espionage. I actually had an exhibitor sneak into another exhibitor's booth, medical emergencies, and evacuation procedures. And those risks still exist today, but the reality of event risks in 2026 is far more complex. Today's planners are having to navigate an expanding landscape of potential threats, including force majeure events, labor shortages, cybersecurity attacks, economic uncertainty, civil unrest, protests, widespread disease outbreaks, transportation shutdowns, extreme weather, and persistent supply chain disruptions. So risk is no longer just an operational concern. Risk is a strategic business issue that impacts every decision for our event that we make. So, in our short 25 minutes together here, I want to highlight how event planners can be forward thinking in negotiating event contracts to address our current day realities. So, while many draft contracts provided to us as planners by suppliers still rely on outdated boilerplate language that was written for a more predictable business environment. And the common risk shields then that we might expect to see in a supplier's draft contract could include things like limitation of liability clauses. So that means restricting the supplier's financial exposure. It could include indemnification provisions, which is transferring responsibilities for losses to the event organizer. Boilerplate language might have insurance requirements, which is providing financial protection against claims against the supplier. There might be language about caps on financial damages, which is setting a maximum payout limit for the supplier. There could be language for exclusions for indirect and or consequential losses, and that's the supplier avoiding liability for secondary damages. And then quite often there is something that addresses force majeure, which is protecting the supplier against uncontrollable events. Now, if you were really listening to my explanation, what we see in boilerplate like contract templates is one-sided language. You may have astutely heard one-sided nature of the use of common risk shields in boilerplate templated contracts. Contracts in our industry are primarily drafted and issued by the suppliers, and the suppliers have engaged legal counsel to create contract language that protects their own interests financially, logistically, even reputationally, and just as they should. Draft contracts in our industry are not balanced in risk shields for both supplier and the event. Rarely do draft event contracts protect the event's interests financially, logistically, or reputationally. The ability to balance event contracts in order to assess, mitigate, manage risk is not just a nice to have or an administrative task. To me, it is one of the defining core competencies of professional event planners. And yes, that is absolutely a hill I'm willing to die on. Contracts are a core competency. All right, so where risks may exist, a balanced contract allocates risk protections to one party or the other or is shared. A balanced contract identifies foreseeable disruptions before they happen and clearly assigns responsibilities. Strong protective contracts create operational clarity during a crisis, and they really kind of help reduce the emotional decision making and potential conflict. Now, the goal is not to eliminate risk entirely, which is probably impossible, but to reduce the financial exposure, to reduce operational chaos, and to reduce reputational damages. So, event planners must shift from reactive problem solvers to being proactive risk negotiators. So, I want to just touch on a few of the ways that we can create balanced contracts when it comes to risk shields. So, force majeure. I know everyone might be tired of hearing about force majeure, but in reality, it is more important than ever to understand this highly legal concept and to more importantly, understand when and how this concept is applicable and when and how it is not applicable. The legal eagles in our industry, such as Joshua Grimes, Tyra Warner, and Jonathan Howe, to name a few, are urging us planners to have challenging and frank conversations with our suppliers about the new realities that need to be considered in force majeure language. Force majeure clauses for today's events and forward looking need to move beyond the historical examples. We need to be thinking from an event perspective about disease, epidemic, and pandemics. Government regulations, advisories, recommendations, mandates, laws, statutes, and orders. And I actually extracted that directly from um, the lawyer Joshua Grimes, that wording, because it covers all of the possibilities. It's not just left up to government regulation. So I'm not aware of how all of these are different, but we need to be aware that there are different categories of government decisions that can impact our event. So credit to Josh for providing us planners with those options. You also want to look at travel bans, international, not having access to come into a country, but also corporate travel bans if you're working for a corporation. What does that look like? And outline what that is as a real risk for the event. Supply chain failures or labor disruptions, climate emergencies. And Josh also brought this one forward that I hadn't thought about. Law enforcement advises safety of the event cannot be assured with reasonable security measures. That one's like, whoa, okay. So the police are engaging with you as the planner saying it's really not safe to be hosting this event in this location or a particular venue. All right. So, in this unstable and ever changing world we're planning events in, planners need to understand that there actually are four legally defendable positions for force majeure. And I know I used to just be familiar with illegal and impossible, but there is also, commercially impracticable, and there's also inadvisable. So, what planners need to know is that the force majeure language needs to be related to and tied back to the purpose of the event language that planners should have negotiated into the event contract. So you are creating the story, the rationale, the reason behind the event, and you're tying that into whether something becomes more burdensome because of a force majeure event. So is it illegal or impossible or commercially impracticable or inadvisable to host your event? And then finally, planners must advocate for the realities of fulfilling that contract due to force majeure through partial performance or what you might call reduced sized events. And that's a big one. We learned that lesson really clearly during COVID. You may have planned an event and contracted for 500, but when the impact of COVID was layered on top, you may have been able to host an event for 200, and that partial performance due to unforeseen burdensome events outside of the control of the event organizer or the supplier, then you're dealing with reduced sized events. And we should be planning that as a potential risk when we're negotiating our contracts. And I'm just going to say here, if these 3 points alone are new to you or unclear, I'm just going to put in a shameless plug for the Certified Event Contract Professional Credential Program because we go deep into understanding these. So, when you look at sleeping rooms, which is a big part of many event contracts, that also becomes a focus that is highly impacted by volatility and uncertainty. So planners should be looking to negotiate more powerful flexibility mechanisms into their event contracts. So this might look like negotiating more frequent review dates of the block size to be able to keep right sizing it in response to changing circumstances. You may want to identify a specific portion of the sleeping room block that is reserved for international guests. And because my event experience is more national versus international, this point was made by Joshua Grimes in a recent webinar. And I thought that's just brilliant because if you know that a certain percentage of your attendees are coming from international destinations, which you've outlined in your purpose of the event language, then perhaps allocating a certain percentage for international guests and negotiating different release dates for those and different potential damages. I thought that was a brilliant strategy for dealing with international attendance. You can also require and request more flexibility in the attrition percentages. So don't really be clear about why flexibility and greater attrition percentages are necessary. Um, Contracting the ability to resell sleeping rooms to other events. Quite often, that boilerplate language limits a group to not be able to resell any space or any sleeping rooms. And that may be an option to help you mitigate risk. And then, obviously, as we just discussed, addressing partial performance due to force majeure. Then we can look at food and beverage. And I know I've said in previous conversations and in this forum, I believe that the whole subject of food and beverage contract clauses are really long overdue for an overhaul. Most suppliers' contracts focus on the food and beverage minimum, the revenue minimum, and perhaps the name, the date, and the size of the food and beverage functions within the event. But let's face it, there is so much more that planners must consider related to food and beverage in order to create risk shields for their events. So let's consider food ingredient, food production, food supply chain that forces price escalations. Quite often, we don't have menus attached to our contracts, which we probably should. We don't have pricing benchmarked. Um, we food item substitutions by the supplier to in order to cut costs. And how might the event be able to mitigate those decisions and be a part of the decision making? Staffing shortages experienced by the supplier, and then we live through on site during the time of the event. And I will say that I rarely see a contract that even addresses the supplier's commitment to staffing the event. How many staff? What roles will they be in? What training do they have? How does the supplier right size the staffing complement according to event size changes? So then there's also service level reductions by the supplier. Again, rarely do contracts provide measurable commitments regarding service levels, and yet service levels and service offerings are often important reasons for choosing that particular supplier. There's also tariffs, which I'm a Canadian, so it's not as much a part of my daily life. But if the supplier's costs are increased or impacted by tariffs, who is absorbing the cost of these? What if the tariff is reversed? Who is being refunded? And that is a topic for other experts. All of the like that is just not my area of expertise at all, but we need to consider them because they are a real reality at this point. Also, thinking about dietary and allergen compliance, being sued for food related incidents is a very real risk for events. And again, suppliers' contracts rarely address these considerations. And this is particularly important when food and beverage services and products are provided on an exclusive basis by the supplier. And then the last 2 points are the same as the previous, making sure that our food and beverage clauses are related to partial performance due to force majeure and to negotiate food and beverage attrition damages on profit replacement rather than revenue. All right, I'm going to take a sip and I'm going to breathe. All right. Indemnification should always be provided for both the supplier and the event organizer or the client. In fairness, many suppliers' contracts now have indemnification of each party to the other. But we need to be always looking and be aware that if the supplier is only requiring the group to indemnify the supplier, which means that the group is protecting the supplier against losses, damages, claims, or legal costs, then that leaves the event wildly exposed and underprotected. So in the contract, then the planner needs to negotiate that both the supplier and the event should be held responsible and protect the other party. The indemnification language should absolutely mention that both the supplier and the event should be held responsible for their own negligence. Make sure that that is from both perspectives. We both have opportunities of oversights, mistakes, things that are not intended to cause harm, but are in fact negligent. We want to protect ourselves from those potential risks. If the event contract includes the providing of liquor products, liquor liability should be carefully discussed and language should be negotiated into the contract. And in almost all circumstances, language about the responsibilities and the execution of emergency procedures by the supplier should be negotiated into the contract. And I will say that 99.9% of supplier drafted draft contracts are silent on the issue of emergency and emergency procedures. And we're going to look at insurance. And insurance, it's often a requirement in suppliers' contracts, but it actually is one of the most important risk shields that are available to event organizers because insurance helps transfer financial exposure away from the organization, the client, when unexpected incidents occur. So, event organizers can purchase a variety of insurance policies depending on the type, size, location, and risk profile of the event. And I've listed a few here: commercial general liability insurance, event cancellation insurance, cyber insurance, liquor liability, as we just mentioned, weather insurance, volunteer accident insurance, property insurance, and there's lots more. But be aware that it goes just beyond commercial general liability insurances, which what we're usually required to show proof of. There are other options to protect the event and the event organizer. And then I'm going to wrap it up with a couple of random thoughts. Time is slipping by, I know. We could spend the whole day together on this topic. I wanted to just throw in some random ones. So, first, refuse, if at all possible, to pay 100% of the master invoice before the event. It is a more frequently seen practice and request by the suppliers to pay everything up front. And there may be some rationale, but it truly is a potential risk that the event organizer is taking on if there is non-performance or there is underperformance by the supplier. So if the event has paid everything up front, being able to mitigate those risks of underperformance or non-performance by the supplier is damn near impossible. There's no incentive for the supplier. Second point, negotiate to have your event deposits held in a separate account by the supplier, or negotiate when really, monies are involved and sizable deposits. Share the cost of putting those deposit monies into an escrow account. The real reality of bankruptcy, foreclosure, sale, there's lots of things that may impact the integrity of your money being held by the supplier. Wherever there is ambiguity in contract language, please request and require that you create objective definitions that both parties clearly understand and agree to, and then are able to be measured. So don't leave something vague if it relates to what could impact your event. Ask for clarity and ask for language to be included. And then address remedies in clear and succinct language in the contract. Remedies are the rights or the solutions available to one party when the other party fails to meet its contractual obligations. So you can think of remedies in the forms of financial compensation, termination rights, refunds or credits, specific additional performance, and withholding payments. So I want to leave you with 5 questions to ask yourself, your team, your client if this contract is future ready. So we want to be requiring proactive thinking and not just reactive negotiating. So here are my 5 questions. 1, does the event contract clearly identify foreseeable risks? We know that there's potential for supplier bankruptcy. We know there's potential for closed borders. We know that there is potential for allergen lawsuits, all of those kinds of things. Are you proactively negotiating um, a, a contract that protects foreseeable risks? Then, does the event contract provide flexibility if conditions change? So we used to kind of think one and done, but now we're booking longer out, we are booking more complicated events, and we truly need to work hard to make sure that the event contracts that we negotiate provide flexibility if our environment around us, the business environment, the world environment, the social environment changes. How do we adapt to that? And that's going to take actual real discussions with your supplier team, and to really extract those possibilities and to get them negotiated. The third question is, are the operational and the financial expectations of both the supplier and the event clearly defined and measurable in this event contract? So, have you made sure that terms are clearly written out, deadlines are clearly established, remedies are clearly discussed, all of those kinds of things where you are, both sides are making commitments to the other. Are they clearly articulated in the event contract? Question number 4, does the event contract fairly allocate responsibility between parties? As I said originally, if we just simply accept a supplier drafted contract, then we are accepting the protections for the supplier. We're not getting protections for our event. And so we want to make sure that the language that we end up with, it allocates responsibilities for both parties. The supplier gets what they need, the event gets what they need. And then finally, question number 5. If a crisis occurs tomorrow, would this event contract help solve problems, or perhaps would it create more of them? And that is such a huge topic. I'm just going to leave it right there. So I'm going to wrap up the content of this today in the same way that I started it. I want to say, in unstable times, the quality of your negotiated event contract may determine the success or the survival of your event. Planners should always be thinking, does our contract actually protect us now and in the future? So I have 3 things before we leave today. If you want to learn more about event contracting and negotiations, please consider the Certified Event Contract Professional Credential Program, and the website's there on this slide. Second, I encourage you to register today for next month's Event Contracts Exposed episode on June 17th called Show Me the Money Negotiating Financial Terms in Event Contracts. And then I always want you to remember a well negotiated event contract isn't just a document, it's your power, it's your protection, and it's your peace of mind. Bye for now, folks.